from the audience. So, my initial question is directed to Mr. Goldsmith, and it's basically, at what stage in the production of a film is a composer usually brought in? Is music always the last thought in a film production's minds?
Which one? This one. There's no pattern for that. I've been engaged for a film before a director's been engaged. Such was the case on Star Trek motion picture. Sometimes I've been engaged 2 weeks before I want me to record the picture. Sometimes I've been engaged after the picture's been scored, such as the case of Chinatown, where I rescored the film. Sometimes during production. There's no set pattern. The last 2 years I've been usually engaged before the picture's been started. So there's no pattern. I mean, I could get a call tomorrow and say, would you start the next day to work? So.
Does it ever help to read the script, or does that give preconceived ideas which would have to be rejected at a later date?
The script is very deceiving. I mean, you can get a brilliant script and you can see it transformed on the screen in a very inadequate way. You can see an inferior script given a whole new injection of life by a brilliant director. But you have to read a script if you're going to accept an assignment before the picture's made. And then hope. That's why I've had some rather disastrous results because the script didn't quite come out like I thought it would.
Have you ever been on the location of a film?
Yeah. It doesn't really help much. If any of you have seen a film being shot, it's just pretty boring. I mean, I just spent 2 days on the shoot, on Gremlins 2, which I'm sure is no secret by now. And I just thank God I'm not an actor. Boy, is that boring.
At what stage does the actual spotting take place, and can you briefly explain the relationship between the composer and the music editor?
Well, the music editor is depending. I mean, what I work with, Kenny Hall, is an immense help. I mean, there aren't too many around like him. It goes back to the old breed of music editor who was really an ally to the composer, a real right-hand person. But when you work with someone as long as I work with Kenny, it becomes second nature. And Kenny starts with me when we spot the picture. He's there to take notes and where the music starts, where the music ends. Any discussions I have with the director about mood or changes or concept, he'll write down. So he sort of acts as a secretary too. And then he breaks the film down for me, which means he gives me the timings to write to. And then as I write it, he takes it and cues the film. Also catches my mistakes and timings, which I'm making up a lot of them. And since he's musical and as a musician, he can see where I'm short bars or too long bars and say I've got to cut or I've got to add. And he balances, evens out the timing, and then he marks the film, cues the film up. He's at the recording when I record. Generally at that point he's sort of a cheering section to keep you going. It becomes very discouraging at times. I mean, writing music is a rather lonely profession, a very insecure one, more so than any of the arts. And when you finally perform this music, you're really performing it for an audience of dilettantes who really don't know much about music, that the producer and the director. And they can love something on the scoring stage and they go on the dubbing stage and all of a sudden they don't like it. There's a certain infectious quality of a large orchestra and live musicians. I mean, I remember going back when I first started in radio, the cast would read the script and would go through this routine, and I would come in with the orchestra during the cast lunch break, and the cast would always stay and eat their lunch in the studio because they got so excited when an orchestra came in. There's something very infectious about that. So the same thing goes on the recording stage. But Kenny's there to sort of keep me level-headed and make sure I didn't catch this cue right, or was there all wrong there, and what do you think about that? Or he plays the devil's advocate with me. And then after that, he places the music in the film, cuts it in. A lot of times the film has been changed after we score the picture. and the budget doesn't allow, he will have to cut the music or do some magic with scissors to make the music fit. So I'm very dependent upon Kenny. That's why he's in my contract, that he has to be part of it. Does that answer your question?
Very fully. Film is basically an art based on collaboration. So how closely do you like to work with the actual film's directors?
Well, asking that, it's not based on collaboration?
It is based.
Oh, yes. Well, the closer I can work with a director, the better. I mean, some directors work very close with you. Some don't. I mean, a man like Spielberg is at your house every day if you ask him to. Which is a pleasure because he loves music and wants to be involved in it. And other directors, I mean, I've had to spot a picture of the director wasn't even around. It just depends. I mean, the more collaboration there is, the better. The longer you work with a director, the easier it is. I mean, a man like Schaffner, it was so easy. We had so few words between us, but we knew. And a guy like Joe Dante, the new picture will be the 6th film I've done with him, so you get to know each other. I've always said the relationship between a composer and a director for the first time, they're like a boy and a girl going out on their first date. Everybody's very polite with one another, and but they don't want to make any waves, so I don't sometimes want to really get the best results that way. Pull a little hair and scream and yell a little bit to get what you want.
Many directors probably are unable to explain exactly what they need for a composer, as it's maybe something they can't define technically. As with photography and sound and so on, does it help if the director has a knowledge of music and is able to give basic instructions like the music should have a Bach-like feel here, or be reminiscent of Rachmaninoff or something like that?
Well, that's a hindrance. I mean, I don't need a little bit of knowledge is dangerous sometimes. There's one director, so I play the drums, and he was an authority on music. No, I'd rather have a director like a Robert Wise who says, I don't know anything about music, but I know when it's right and when it's wrong. And he was speaking, it sounds like a corny phrase, which it is. I've heard it said so often, but in his case, he's right, because his dramatic instinct is so strong that he was right. I remember in Sand Pebbles, we were doing a scene, a big panoramic shot of the sand pebbles going up the river, and had this big pounding music, and it was very majestic. I was playing the panorama instead of the situation emotionally. And he said, it's a little boat going up this big river. And he was right, it should have been a very quiet piece of music, which had changed it to. But he knows dramatically what he wants, and I'd rather have that from a director. A man like Schaffner could express himself both musically and dramatically. I think I made that point clear the other night at BBC. So it depends. I mean, a director like the Australian director, Richard Franklin, who adores music, and he could talk for hours, and we've sat and talked. I remember in Psycho 2, we sat and talked for hours and hours and hours trying to get a handle on it. And he just finally dropped one word, innocence, and that triggered something in me. In other words, the director has to have the patience to sit and work with the composer. Unfortunately, so many directors feel intimidated by music and by the composer because they don't know anything about it, which is one of my objections to the training of filmmakers. I mean, filmmakers will go to school and hopefully learn about all of the technical aspects of filmmaking, but fail to learn anything about the technical aspects of the application of music. So when it comes to working with a composer, they're more or less intimidated, and I think the less they can do or have to do with it, the happier they are. It's sort of like a necessary evil. And it doesn't make for good results. A guy like Joe Dante, he tracks his own pictures, so fortunately it's all Bernard Herrmann, so it's easy to get around. But you get the idea where he's going. So every director is different. That's where it's very interesting. A composer more than anybody else in the film. You can work with 4 or 5 directors a year, and not one of them is the same. So you're doing, getting acquainted act all the time.
Can you briefly outline how you work with the orchestrator, or what the orchestrator's position is in the makeup of the score, and how important the orchestrator's contribution is?
Well, I can only, speak for myself. I mean, I'm always asked this question: what does the orchestrator do? What does the orchestrator do? What does the orchestrator do? I mean, Arthur Morton's favorite line is, famous line is he says, I take the music from the yellow paper and put it in the white paper. I write everything on a 9-line sketch, indicating 2 lines for the woodwinds, 2 lines for the brass, 3 lines for keyboards, harp, whatever, 2 lines for the strings, and a couple lines for the percussion. I literally am orchestrating it as I go along, in shorthand form, in other words. I'm saving myself the labor of writing out 48 staves, and I indicate what instruments are playing and how and where and why. Arthur takes it and just puts it on the big paper. I don't leave anything to chance for anyone. I mean, it's my music. I want it to sound the way I hear it. I mean, I don't compose for the piano, I compose for the orchestra. The only thing I compose for the orchestra is write for the instruments. But time doesn't allow me to do the actual labor of putting it in a full score, so that's where the orchestrator comes in. I did first, the first picture I used an orchestrator on was Lonely or the Brave. And that was sort of a holdover from the old studio days where you had to have an orchestra. That's the way it worked. And I was instructed that I had to have an orchestra. It was David Tampkin, who was a wonderful man, a great musician. And I just didn't know how to make a sketch. I mean, I just wasn't used to it. And I remember about the first 4 or 5 cues I orchestrated myself anyway. I mean, I was fine. I said, you've got to start sketching it. So that's what I did. There's a very funny anecdote about that. Was Bernard Herrmann was raising hell with me. He was screaming at me when they were walking in the streets in the Universal. He started screaming at me from across the street. You're like all the rest of the Hollywood whores. You're using an orchestrator. The man was known for these strange fits. And, I mean, he literally was screaming at me, and I ducked. And I said, but I was instructed. You sold out. No. So I remember we were recording the music, and I wasn't conducting. I wasn't allowed to conduct either. Joseph Gershenson was there. And we came to another big cue, and just as they were starting a take, Benny walked in. I said, oh no. He was still a revered, feared figure then, and I said, boy, we're really in trouble now. And he made the take, and then he comes over to me. I can see he's got her cut loose. He starts screaming. He says, it's too good, don't let him have it. It's too good for the picture. Keep it, don't let him have it. And, you know, even though someone else illustrated it. But the main thing is that I think that Arthur Morton, who I've worked with mostly the last 25 years, or 20 years, is a very close friend. And as I said earlier, it's a very lonely occupation, writing music. Like most of all the art forms, you're just stuck in a room by yourself. And you sometimes, under the pressure we work, you get a little bit nervous and insecure, and one doesn't have time to sit and contemplate what one's done, and the orchestrator sort of acts as your alter ego and support and all that, and once in a while it'll say, that's not bad, and you're starting to doubt yourself. And it's gotten to the point now that there are very few words exchanged between us because he knows what I'm thinking pretty well. Although not always, I keep surprising him. And lately, young lady Nancy Beach has been helping Arthur out because he's getting on in years and slowing down a little bit. And traveling doesn't agree with him too much, so